Hi Oak Life, Gina here, your spiritual formation intern, and today I'm going to be sharing a little bit about the practice of centering prayer. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of centering prayer, which I find fascinating. I'm going to talk about the methods of how to do centering prayer and why it's important or what the benefits are of centering prayer. First off, I want to say that I've been doing centering prayer for about a decade, and it has changed my life dramatically, which I can talk a little bit more about at the end. And then the other thing I will say just right off the bat is that centering prayer can be sort of thought of as meditation, but it just has a more specific twist with the divine. Meditation doesn't always involve the divine, but so I just wanted to say that right away. So Thomas Keating says the spiritual journey does not require going anywhere because God is already with us and in us. And centering prayer is doing just that. It's entering into that space. Even though God is with us and in us already, God loves the invitation, and it's important for us to give our consent to God, that we're meeting God in a space. So first I want to start out by sharing a little bit of the history of centering prayer. It dates really far back. I want to say 400 BC, which is when our desert mothers and fathers existed. And they're just modern. They were like monks today, like hermits, but they lived in the desert. And they were extremely wise. And actually where spiritual direction was first sort of formed, or the idea of spiritual direction came from regular people stopping at these caves and hermits that the desert fathers and mothers lived in, asking for insight and advice. And that's actually how spiritual direction was birthed. But centering prayer goes all the way back to them, and I just find that just fascinating. It's so old, but it was Thomas Keating and other pastors and priests alike that made it more of a modern, tangible practice. Thomas Keating being one of them, who is a Trappist monk out east. So they sort of took what happened in those early days and adapted it into centering prayer as we know it today. So what is centering prayer? Centering prayer is creating an interior quietness with God. It's purposely meeting with the divine in silence. So we can all experience silence on any given day, on any given level. But centering prayer is knowing that you're going to meet with God in a quiet place on purpose. It's a place of returning to your heart and your deepest center. God says, "Be still and know that I am God." But how often do we find ourselves being still? Centering prayer helps us become more comfortable with being still and knowing that God is God. Some of the benefits for centering prayer. Well, first of all, it might feel like you're not doing anything at all. But let me tell you, a lot is happening. It will feel like you're not even praying, because in a sense you're really not, and I'll explain that. But God sort of does all the work. We give him our consent that we're there and that we'd like to meet with God. You will start to see the benefits of centering prayer once you see if you're able to implement the practice 20 minutes every day, sometimes 20 minutes twice a day. It's a serious practice, so it's something that needs to continue to happen in order to see the benefits. but you will definitely notice that you're more calm. You will notice more movement, and you'll have more of a natural rest in God. But there is one goal in centering prayer. Well, maybe two. To meet with God and to not think. How would you like to not think for 20 minutes? You will be learning to let go of every thought, and again, just consent to be before God. So how do you do centering prayer? What does this look like? Well, first you need to set a timer for 20 minutes. I know it seems like a lot, right? It's really important to start with 20 minutes because even if you end early and you just can't sit there for more than 10 minutes or 5 minutes, that's okay. You don't judge yourself. There's no rule of you're good or bad or you've done it right or wrong. Nothing like that. It's just important to set out the 20 minutes because a lot of different things kind of work themselves out as you're sitting in those 20 minutes, which I'll further explain. So that's the first thing you'll want to do, is set that timer. So next, you'll want to obviously find your spot and settle in somewhere. And you are going to want to consent to God's presence and action within. Just a small acknowledgement is all that's needed. It's like, hey God, I'm here and I really want to be with you right now. Will you meet with me? I love that, giving consent. Second, you will want to pick a word to help ground you. So there is a sacred word to be had in centering prayer. Excuse me. You will find yourself getting off track, possibly, and you'll start to have thoughts the minute you sit down, and you'll want to go down that thought train. But the reason that you want to pick a sacred word is because that will help you when your thoughts start to come, because they will come. Thoughts will be there. You're human after all. But this sacred word that you pick is going to help ground you and bring you back to your center and bring you back into the practice. So, some options for words could be Jesus, Father, Mother, Mary, or God. And in other languages, it could be Kyrie, Jesu, Jeshua, Abba, Mater, Maria, or words like love, peace, divine, holy, stillness, faith, silence, and in other languages, amor, shalom, and amen. But you can pick any word. It doesn't have to be on this list. These are just options. So once you have your word, you will want to sit comfortably with your eyes closed and settle in briefly and silently. You introduce your sacred word, which is now the symbol of your consent to God's presence and action within. So a few side notes. Comfortably means finding a position and spot that will not distract you. So for instance, you don't want your leg to go numb or stiff. You want to make sure, that your feet you're present to your feet and where they're at, because those can get kind of crampy and put pressure on other parts of the body when you're sitting. The next thing to note is that you want to make sure that your back is as straight as possible. That is the best position to come into because it is grounding and you can feel your spine. It holds your neck up straight and your head, even though you may find your head dropping a bit in the practice, which is okay. And if you fall asleep, there's nothing to feel bad or guilty about. You'll get right back to the practice, and that's okay. There is no shame in that. So the third thing that you're going to want to do is when you're sitting there, you've given your consent, you've introduced your word, you're going to start to become aware of your thoughts. So when you start to become aware of your thoughts, that's your chance to return gently to your sacred word. That will reground you. Just say the word again, and then just be grounded. And I have a few side notes about that. Remember, thoughts are not necessarily what is true. Thoughts is an umbrella term for every perception, sense of perceptions, feelings, images, memories, reflections. And thoughts are a normal part of centering prayer. The goal is to not say, I can't have any thoughts. Please, thoughts, go away. But when they happen, just return to your sacred word. This is the only activity we initiate during centering prayer. You don't have to do much. And the last thought about that is you may find your center so much that your sacred word becomes vague or even starts to disappear. And that's okay. Just when the thoughts start going, just don't hop on the thought train. Say your centering word and come back to your center, and that will ground you. And you will notice the thoughts will start to become less and less. If not the first 20 minutes or the second 20 minutes, but usually even in that first 20 minutes, the very first time around, you will start to notice. And you will notice within a week that your thought life, you're not so flooded by thoughts. The fourth thing that you want to do, and the last thing, is at the end of the prayer period, remain in silence for a few minutes and keep your eyes closed for a couple of minutes. You just want to start to awaken slowly and gently. Give yourself a few minutes to adjust. So a few practical points and further thoughts that I have about centering prayer. The principal effects of centering prayer are experienced in daily life, not in the practice of centering prayer itself. So a lot of time when we think of prayer, we think of, I'm going to say this to God, I'm going to be thankful for that, I'm going to ask for this, or we're crying out, or we're desperate, whatever it is. That's a lot of action. It takes a lot of emotional energy. But in centering prayer, you don't necessarily hear from God in that moment or notice the differences in that time that you're doing it. It's like I said earlier, you will notice the benefits in your life outside of centering prayer because something extremely magical and miraculous is happening during centering prayer. You may feel some physical effects while you are in centering prayer. Allow your mind to rest briefly in the sensation. That's okay. If you do start to feel something physically, just return back to your center with your word and consent and just be there. It's okay to be distracted. The more centering prayer is practiced, the less distracted you'll become over time. So that's a really cool thing that you will start to notice. Next, keep your expectations in check. This is not a technique. This is not something to be successful at. This is not a relaxation exercise or hypnosis. And this is not a charismatic gift. So for once, you don't have to try to achieve anything at all. Sorry about my dog barking. He's old, and during this pandemic, it's been a real struggle to meet his every need between me and my husband sharing our space. So be gentle with yourself. This is not something you need to achieve. This is not something you need to be good or bad at. You don't have to find success. So remember that. And the last 2 points are that centering prayer is not, and here's what centering prayer is not. Having no thoughts, making the mind blank. It's not something to achieve, like I said. And it's also not repeating your sacred word over and over and over and over either. You only want to reintroduce that word when you get off track and get distracted. And lastly, centering prayer is at the same time a relationship with God and a discipline to foster that relationship in an exercise of faith, hope, and love. And centering prayer habituates us to the language of God, which is silence. So God's voice is a felt presence. It is not necessarily audible like ours. I mean, it's not audible like ours, right? We don't really hear God's voice like me talking to you, words coming out of my mouth. That's not how God works. But when we are silent with God, with consent to be with God in centering prayer, we can later in our lives throughout the week start to hear God's voice possibly, and we can just appreciate centering prayer for what it is in that moment, meeting in silence and getting some rest for our souls. So I hope that you found this helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them, and I would love to answer any questions. And if you would like to talk about how your practice is going, that would be great. The last thing I'll say is that centering prayer might not want to be done right at like dinner time, before or after dinner, because you might get kind of sleepy. So save it for, mid-morning, late afternoon, something like that. But God bless you, and good luck in centering prayer.